Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this video. We have here is a USB flash drive that you can see is clearly damaged. The USB connector is broken from the board and 3 of the 4 traces have been lifted. So we're going to see if we can fix this thing up. Alright, and you'll have to bear with me because I believe it was around 1 in the morning when I was trying this, so clearly wasn't thinking straight. Because my initial thought was to just try and scrape around these missing pads to just get enough to see if I can get enough copper to show to just throw a little bit of solder on there and just put the connector back on so we can quickly plug this thing in. It's pretty clear that that's not going to work. So my next approach will be to actually, find some components or make new tracks to solder on some wires to. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing now is, if you look at the top of your screen, that one pad, that is the power line for this chip or this PCB. And that whole, the green outline around there, that's all that track. So what I'm trying to do right now is I'm just going to add a little bit of solder to that capacitor right there. And that's where I'm going to attach my first wire, and that'll be the power wire from the USB. So that will hopefully just connect into that capacitor and then power up the rest, of the board. Also, this is the first time that I'm really using this microscope that actually does a pretty good job of recording. It's got a little tiny screen, so it's actually kind of hard to see what you're doing while recording. So I've pre-tinned this wire, and now I'm trying to connect it to this capacitor. And I'm just trying to find the right angle to get this in there to be able to use the soldering iron. It's not much clearance from the microscope, so it is a little tough. This, side doesn't appear to be working all that well. Eventually you'll see that I turn it to have the cable facing the opposite direction, and that goes much smoother. Now, how I tin up these wires is pretty much I will just strip the wire, dip it in some flux, and then with my soldering iron, I will put solder on the iron and then touch the iron with the solder on it to the fluxed wire, and the wire would typically soak up the solder and makes that nice little connection. And this will help with now when you just place the heat on here, it'll just melt the solder and connect to that capacitor. So now it's there, give it a little tug, and it seems to be good to go. And now it's time to start the next wire and find the next part to connect the wire to. Okay, so we're going to try and connect the second wire here to this second pad. These traces, if you can look at these 2 middle traces, they go to the second and third pin from the bottom side of that chip. These are the data lines, so these are pretty important to get right. You could see me struggle here with my tweezer just trying to scrape away some of the green coating of this PCB. That little depression of that second pad just kept forcing the tweezers just to go in there, so I was having a hard time. But finally, you can see I follow these traces there just to see what pins they go to. So I make sure not to mix them up because those 2 traces are very close to each other. And now I will start to scrape away at the, this green coating to show some of the copper. And once we have some copper showing, that's what we'll use as our new pad. So I'm just scraping away at this track here, trying to reveal as much copper as I can, and I think I'm getting to a point where I'm happy. The one thing I will have a problem with here is that there is copper showing very close to this one track, so if you apply too much solder or bridge those, it could definitely corrupt the data or just make it not show up at all. So we will have to be careful about that. So right now, I'm just going to add some flux to this copper, and then we're going to add some solder to tin it up, and the flux is just going to help the solder bond with the copper and just make a nice solder joint. Flux is very useful. I never used to use it in the past, but now that I'm trying to do this more regularly, I don't know why I waited so long to use it. It's definitely a big help, and if you don't use flux, I highly recommend it. I'm just gonna come in with a little bit of solder and then get my solder and iron, which is really dirty. I didn't really know that, or didn't really pay enough attention to it, and as you can see, I think the dirt from solder and iron comes off into the flux, and it just makes this really nasty orangey brown color there. So just applying solder to the copper there to, create our new pad. And now that that's there, I try to clean up the board. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure why I went too crazy trying to clean this thing up, especially because that new contaminated spot of flux there just wouldn't go away. And this board is just to try and get data off. We're never going to use it again. I don't know why I was just trying to go so thorough and clean, but I did. Didn't really work out that well. So we'll just have to move on. Okay, so now I've tinned up another wire, and I'm going to prepare that and try and solder it to that top pad that we just created. And as you'll see, just trying to place the pre-tinned wire on the solder pad and just hopefully apply enough pressure and heat to have the two solder joints connect and bond. And having a little bit of trouble, and then as you'll see is when I do get it, it dries to the wrong pad, and we don't want that because that'll either not work or give us corrupted data. So now try again. I think right now I'm just fixing up the wire and getting ready to take another pass at it. I do have this PCB. It's just taped down with a piece of electrical tape, and honestly, it wasn't very tacky, and definitely moved around more. So I don't know if I had like a vise or a little PCB holder, probably would have helped, or just better tape. But as you'll see, board moves around a little too much. That doesn't make this any easier. So I fixed up the wire. I think I also may have cut it down a little bit to help. But now I'm going to try again. And it does stick, but when I was doing this, I thought I saw it connect to that bottom pad. So I just grabbed the tweezers and I want to hold it and then try and just move it up, because I don't want those two pads touching, because again, that could do some screwy stuff with our data or just not make this work at all. So just move that wire up. I'm pretty satisfied. So now it's time to connect the next wire. Okay, so now I'm gonna come in with my tweezers and try and scratch out a new pad, some more copper. But since these two traces are so close together, I don't feel it's a good idea to go right next to this other wire where that original trace is from that third pad. So what I'm going to try and do is just create a new pad just right, down there, a little further down on that track, just so that it gives us enough clearance to attach another wire. So I'm just scraping away like we did with the previous section until we got enough copper showing that we can add some flux and solder and attach a wire. This section should be a little bit easier because there's really nothing in our way, and we don't have to worry about maybe bridging a connection by having it soldered to a different track. So again, just gonna throw more flux on there because flux is your friend, and then we'll grab a little bit of solder and tin up that. I'm actually pretty happy with the quality of this microscope. It's wasn't expensive, but it wasn't cheap either. But it does a pretty good job of recording. I just wish that it could record and output to a large screen at the same time, but it can't. It can only do one or the other. So it's a little hard to work on the screen that's provided. You guys definitely have a much better view than I did. But now, so we just add in a little bit of solder to that copper, and now we're gonna tin up another wire and get that ready to connect to this pad, and we're getting there. We're almost done, and hopefully this will work. Okay, so we just come in here with another wire, try and get a good angle on it, and get it in place where we need it to be. And then we'll just apply our soldering iron and try and get this connected to that exposed copper that we created. Okay, so now that is connected, and just give it a little tug and it seems to be fine. And now we're just ready to apply our last cable. Okay, so our last cable is just the ground cable, and that can go to any of the ground points on this board. And since this big anchor points that hold the USB connector in there and try to give it more stability are ground points, we can just tie this in right here. So this is a nice big section, so it shouldn't be too hard to solder to. So again, just grab our pre-tinned wire and apply some heat, let it connect, and then just kind of make sure it's a nice good solder connection. And there we go. All our wires are now connected to the board, so now we just need to connect them to the USB connector. Is just pre-tinned all the wires on the other end, and also dipped the connector in some flux, the USB connector into some flux, and tinned up those points. And now I'm just adding the wires to them, and just by placing the wire on top of it, adding some heat and letting them bond together. So we're just going to do this for all 4 wires, and obviously you're going to want to make sure that you plug them in the correct spots. The top one, in this case, the top one is the power, 2 middle ones are the data, and that bottom one is ground. And as you can see, is the green one has a little bit of stray wires that look like they are touching the yellow one, so we will have to address that when this is all connected. Okay, so now they're all connected, so it's time to address those stray wires from that green cable and eliminate that. So I just get an X-Acto knife and get in there and just cut away at that, because again, we just need to get data off this. It doesn't need to look fantastic, which I still think I went a little overboard trying to make this look neater, and it definitely took me a long time to do, longer than it should have. But just get the X-Acto knife and I cut through that, and now there's no, it's not touching the other cable, so we should be good and ready to give this thing a test. So here we go. This is the final piece, and if you haven't noticed, I'm not wearing gloves because I ran out of gloves, and it's very annoying because flux is very sticky and tacky and your hands get just dirty and grimy. But I'm just gonna, time to plug this thing in and see what happens. So plug it in, you hear Windows make the noise, light lights up, these are all good signs. And then you can see that is now shown in my computer, shows the USB drive, and that it's accessible and all the data is there, and we are now able to access this data and get it off of here onto a good working flash drive. So thanks for checking out this video. Hope you learned something. This was actually really fun to do, as much as it may have looked as like a struggle. But again, thanks for checking it out, and we'll see you again soon.